The auction hall in downtown Chicago glittered under crystal chandeliers, the kind of light that made diamonds sparkle brighter and secrets harder to hide. And on that October evening, the room was filled with exactly the sort of people who collected both. Bankers in tailored suits traded whispers about quarterly earnings while sipping champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And somewhere near the back, a famous football team owner argued quietly with his wife about how much was too much to spend on a car neither of them would ever actually drive. Cameras from 3 different magazines clicked steadily near the stage, capturing faces that mattered and faces that wanted to matter. And every single person in that room understood the unspoken rule of the evening. Whatever happened here would be talked about for months. At the center of it all, seated in the front row with the kind of stillness that commanded more attention than noise ever could, sat Victoria Hayes. And when she crossed her legs and lifted her paddle number for the first lot of the night, 3 other bidders quietly folded their hands and let her win without a fight. She had never lost a single auction in this city. Not once in 11 years, and everyone in that room knew it. The auction house itself had been chosen specifically for evenings like this one, a converted historic theater with a domed ceiling painted decades earlier by an artist nobody remembered anymore. Its gilded balconies now filled with catalog binders instead of opera glasses. Waitstaff moved silently between rows offering champagne nobody really needed. And a string quartet tucked into one corner played softly enough that most guests forgot it was even there, until the music briefly paused between lots. Then, just as the 7th lot rolled toward the stage, a man walked through the side entrance wearing a jacket that had clearly seen too many winters, and for one long, uncomfortable moment, nobody in that glittering room knew what to do with him. He moved through the crowd the way a man moves through a place he doesn't care to impress. Unhurried, unbothered, his boots making a soft sound against the marble floor that seemed almost rude in a room built for silk and silence. A young valet in a crisp black vest actually stepped toward him and asked, with poorly disguised condescension, whether he was there to deliver something, and the man simply smiled, shook his head, and said he was there for a car. Laughter rippled through a cluster of nearby guests, quiet but unmistakable, the kind of laughter people allow themselves when they believe no consequence will follow. He didn't turn to look at them. He found an open seat near the middle of the room, sat down without ceremony, and folded his hands in his lap like someone waiting for a bus rather than a multi-million-dollar sale. Victoria noticed him only because everyone else in her line of sight had noticed him first. A ripple of attention moving through the crowd like wind through wheat, and when her eyes finally landed on him, she felt nothing but mild, fleeting curiosity before turning back toward the stage. She had seen 100 strange faces walk into rooms like this one. She had no reason yet to believe this face would be any different. His name was Ethan Carter. And if anyone in that auction house had bothered to ask him a single honest question, they might have learned that he'd driven 3 hours from a small town in Michigan in a pickup truck with more than 200,000 miles on it, wearing the only decent jacket he owned, carrying nothing but a folded paper checklist in his coat pocket, and a memory he had never spoken about to a stranger. He wasn't rich. He didn't pretend to be. He ran a modest restoration shop out of a converted barn behind his house. The kind of place where the smell of leather, cleaner, and engine oil lived permanently in the walls, and most of his neighbors thought of him as the quiet widower who fixed old cars for a living and kept mostly to himself. What none of them knew, and what none of the glittering crowd in that Chicago ballroom could have guessed by looking at his worn jacket, was that within a very particular circle of people, the kind who didn't advertise their wealth or their knowledge, Ethan Carter's name was spoken with something close to reverence. He had restored vehicles for 2 private museums. He had been flown out, quietly, more than once, by collectors who didn't want their names in any magazine, men and women who trusted exactly one person to touch their most irreplaceable machines. He had woken up that morning before sunrise, the way he woke most mornings, feeding the 2 barn cats that had adopted his property years ago before anyone else in the county was even awake. And he'd spent the drive down, rehearsing nothing at all, because rehearsing had never been his way of preparing for anything that mattered. He wore the jacket not out of ignorance about how it might look, but because it was the same jacket he'd worn to Walter's funeral 3 years earlier, and some part of him had wanted to carry that memory into the room with him tonight, even if nobody else there would ever understand why. Tonight, though, none of that mattered to him. Tonight, he had come for one car, and one car only. And he intended to leave with it, no matter what it cost him. The stage lights shifted, and a hush rolled across the room as two attendants in white gloves wheeled out the seventh lot of the evening, a car so beautiful that even the most jaded collectors in attendance leaned forward in their seats. It was a 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, painted in a deep, glowing silver that seemed to hold light rather than simply reflect it. Its iconic upward swinging doors closed for now, but promising the kind of theater that had made this model legendary since the day it was built. The auctioneer's voice rose with practiced excitement as he described its provenance, explaining that the car had once belonged to a celebrated film actor from Hollywood's golden era, passed through only two owners since, and preserved in a condition so close to original that the inspection report read almost like poetry. He mentioned the engine number, the matching chassis, the untouched interior stitching, each detail landing on the crowd like another log thrown onto a fire that was already burning hot. Somewhere in the third row, a hedge fund manager whispered a number to his associate that made her eyebrows lift. Near the stage, two men who ran a private collection in Texas exchanged a glance that said they had already decided how far they were willing to go. And in the front row, Victoria Hayes sat up a little straighter. Because this car, more than any other lot that night, was the one she had come for. Victoria Hayes had grown up around machines the way other children grow up around bedtime stories, her father having built Hayes Automotive from a single parts warehouse into one of the most respected specialty manufacturing companies in the Midwest, and she had inherited not just his company, but his obsession with automotive history. The Mercedes on that stage wasn't just beautiful to her. It represented an era her father used to talk about with a wistfulness he rarely allowed himself, a golden age of engineering he had spent his whole life chasing in fragments, and Victoria had promised herself, quietly, years ago, that she would one day own a piece of that era for the collection housed beneath Hayes Automotive's headquarters. When the bidding opened, she raised her paddle almost immediately, her voice calm, her expression unreadable, and for a few rounds the auction moved the way these things usually moved when she was involved. Other bidders tested the waters, raised their paddles once, twice, then quietly withdrew when they saw the confidence in her posture. It was a familiar rhythm, almost a dance, and everyone in that room had learned long ago how it usually ended. Then, from somewhere near the middle of the crowd, a paddle went up that nobody expected. Held by a man in a jacket that had clearly seen too many winters, and the entire rhythm of the room broke apart at once. A murmur spread through the crowd like a current through water, heads turning in unison toward the man who had dared to challenge Victoria Hayes, and for a moment the auctioneer himself seemed to hesitate before calling the new bid. Someone near the back laughed under their breath and muttered that the man had clearly wandered into the wrong sale, that he had no idea what he was doing, that this would be over in another round or two, once he realized how far the numbers were about to climb. Victoria turned her head, slowly, and looked at him directly for the first time, studying the plain lines of his jacket, the calm set of his jaw, the complete absence of nervousness in a room designed to make outsiders feel exactly that. She felt no threat in the gesture, only a flicker of irritation mixed with something closer to amusement, the kind of reaction a queen might have toward a stranger who wandered uninvited into her garden. In her mind, she filed him away instantly and dismissively. A man looking for attention, perhaps hoping to be noticed by the cameras near the stage, perhaps simply enjoying the thrill of driving up a price he had no intention of paying. She raised her paddle again without hesitation, expecting the usual outcome, expecting him to fold the way every other pretender in that room eventually folded. He didn't fold. He raised his paddle right back, his expression as steady as if he were ordering coffee, and the number on the display climbed higher than anyone in the room had predicted it would go this early in the bidding. The war between them stretched on longer than anyone expected, each new bid landing like a small detonation across the room, and slowly, one by one, the other interested parties began to lower their paddles and settle back into their seats to simply watch. The Texas collectors were the first to drop out, shaking their heads with grudging respect as the number crossed a threshold they weren't willing to cross themselves. A private jet broker who had been eyeing the car all evening folded not long after, muttering to his companion that whoever this stranger was, he clearly wasn't bluffing. Victoria felt something shift inside her chest that she couldn't quite name. An unfamiliar prickle of genuine curiosity threading its way through her usual composure, because in 11 years of sitting in rooms exactly like this one, she had never once encountered a bidder who refused to be intimidated by her presence. She studied him more closely between bids, searching for the tells she usually relied on: the sweat on the brow, the tightening jaw, the darting eyes that signaled a man in over his head. She found none of it. Ethan Carter sat with his eyes fixed on the car itself, rarely glancing at her, rarely glancing at the crowd. His attention locked entirely on the silver machine, glowing under the stage lights, as if nothing else in that room existed at all. It was that detail, more than the escalating price, more than his refusal to back down, that finally cracked through Victoria's carefully maintained indifference. He wasn't looking at her because he wasn't trying to win against her. He was simply trying to win the car, and the distinction, small as it seemed, was unlike anything she had encountered in this world before. By the time the auctioneer's gavel finally came down, the number had climbed nearly 40% higher than the pre-sale estimate, and a ripple of applause moved through the room, equal parts genuine appreciation and stunned disbelief. Victoria had raised her paddle one final time, driven by something that felt less like strategy and more like reflex. But Ethan had matched her without so much as a flicker of hesitation, and when the number stopped climbing, it was his paddle number that the auctioneer called. For the first time in 11 years, Victoria Hayes had lost an auction. And stranger still, she found that the loss didn't sting the way she expected it to. She watched Ethan rise from his seat, unbothered by the stares now aimed openly in his direction, and walk toward the paperwork table with the same unhurried calm he'd carried since the moment he arrived. Reporters who had spent the evening angling for photographs of Victoria suddenly swarmed toward the mystery bidder instead, firing questions about his identity, his profession, his reasons for wanting the car so badly, and he answered each one politely but briefly, offering nothing that satisfied their curiosity. Victoria remained in her seat a moment longer than necessary, watching him from across the room, turning over a single uncomfortable realization in her mind. She had spent 11 years believing that money was the only language spoken fluently in rooms like this one. And tonight, for reasons she couldn't yet explain, a man in a worn jacket had proven her wrong. She didn't chase him down that night, not directly, though the thought crossed her mind more than once as she watched him disappear through the same side entrance he'd arrived through, unaccompanied, uninterested in the after-party still buzzing behind him. Instead, she did what she always did when something refused to make sense to her. She called her assistant the following morning and asked for answers. Within 2 days, a folder landed on her desk containing everything the assistant had managed to uncover about a man named Ethan Carter, and Victoria read through it twice before she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her own surprise. He wasn't a millionaire hiding behind a costume, as she had half expected. He wasn't the heir to some quiet fortune amusing himself at her expense. He owned a small restoration shop in rural Michigan, employed no more than 2 part-time helpers, and by every conventional financial measure, he was nowhere near wealthy enough to have spent what he'd spent on that Mercedes without consequence. And yet the folder also contained something else entirely, something that made Victoria set down her coffee and read more slowly. Buried in a handful of obscure trade publications and one lengthy feature from a niche automotive journal, Ethan Carter's name appeared again and again, always accompanied by words like meticulous, unmatched, and irreplaceable. He had restored a 1932 Duesenberg for a private museum in Ohio that curators had once declared beyond saving. He had been quietly flown to Europe twice by collectors who guarded their privacy as fiercely as their vehicles. Men whose names Victoria recognized instantly from her father's old circles. Within a very narrow, very serious world, Ethan Carter wasn't a nobody at all. He was, in fact, something far rarer than money. A man other experts deferred to. The realization unsettled her in a way she wasn't fully prepared for, because it meant her first instinct about him had been not just wrong, but wrong, in a way that revealed something uncomfortable about her own assumptions. She had looked at his jacket and his truck, and decided, in an instant, exactly who he was and exactly how much he mattered. And the folder on her desk was quietly, patiently proving her wrong on every count. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria found herself wanting to understand a person rather than simply outmaneuver them. And that desire alone was strange enough to keep her awake later than usual that night, staring at the ceiling of her apartment and turning the evening over in her mind, like a puzzle piece that refused to fit anywhere familiar. She thought about the way he'd looked at the car, not at her, not at the crowd, not even at the number climbing on the display, but at the machine itself, as if it held some private meaning invisible to everyone else in the room. She thought about the calm in his voice when he'd answered the reporters, offering just enough to satisfy politeness and nothing more. And she thought, with a small, reluctant smile she wouldn't have admitted to anyone, that she wanted to know why a man who clearly didn't care about impressing a room full of strangers had been willing to spend so much to win a single car away from her. She found him 3 days later, not through her assistant's research, but through a call she placed herself, tracking down the shop listed in the folder and asking, simply, if Ethan Carter would be willing to speak with her about the car he'd purchased. He agreed without hesitation, suggesting she come by the shop rather than meeting somewhere more convenient for her, and Victoria found herself, for the first time in years, adjusting her entire schedule around someone else's terms. The drive to rural Michigan took longer than she expected, the highway eventually narrowing into quiet county roads lined with soybean fields and the occasional weathered barn, and when she finally pulled into the gravel drive behind a modest farmhouse, she saw the Mercedes parked inside an open garage bay, already surrounded by tools and diagnostic equipment, looking less like a trophy and more like a patient awaiting surgery. Ethan came out to greet her in coveralls stained with grease, wiping his hands on a rag before offering one in greeting. And if he was surprised to see the CEO of Hayes Automotive standing in his driveway, he didn't show it. She asked him directly, without preamble, why he had wanted that particular car badly enough to outbid her. He set the rag down, leaned against the workbench, and told her it wasn't about the car's value at all. It was about the man who had once restored it. He told her about a mentor from decades ago, a man named Walter Grady, who had taught him everything he knew about engines and patience and the particular kind of respect old machines demanded from the people who touched them. Walter had found this exact Mercedes decades earlier, rescued it from a barn where it had sat neglected for years, and had spent the better part of a decade slowly bringing it back to life before selling it to fund his failing shop, a decision that had haunted him for the rest of his years. Ethan had been Walter's apprentice during those final months, watching an old man pour his heart into a machine he ultimately had to let go of out of financial desperation. And Walter had told him once, near the end of his life, that if he ever had the chance, he should find that car again and finish what had truly been started between them. Walter had died 3 years ago, quietly, in the same converted barn where Ethan now worked, and when word had reached him that the Mercedes was going up for auction in Chicago, Ethan had understood immediately that fate was offering him something he couldn't refuse. He wasn't there for prestige or investment or anything the crowd in that ballroom might have assumed. He was there to keep a promise made to a dying man who had shaped the entire course of his life. Victoria listened to the story in complete silence, and by the time he finished, she understood, with sudden and total clarity, that she had never once in her adult life met someone who loved a machine more than he loved what that machine could buy him. Something shifted in her that afternoon. Standing in a garage that smelled of oil and sawdust, listening to a man speak about loyalty and memory, as though they were the most natural things in the world to organize a life around. She thought about her own collection back in Chicago. The climate-controlled vault beneath Hayes Automotive's headquarters, where dozens of rare vehicles sat gleaming under museum lighting, each one acquired not out of love but out of strategy, prestige, or her father's old obsessions passed down to her, like an inheritance she'd never questioned. She found herself, almost without deciding to, inviting Ethan to come see that collection. Curious what a man like him might notice that none of her curators ever had, he agreed, somewhat reluctantly, explaining that he preferred staying close to his own shop. But something in the way she asked made it clear this wasn't really a request she intended to withdraw. 2 weeks later, he arrived at Hayes Automotive's Chicago headquarters in the same worn jacket, looking entirely unimpressed by the marble lobby and glass elevators that usually left visitors momentarily starstruck. Victoria led him down to the vault herself, past 2 layers of security clearance, and watched his expression as the heavy doors opened onto rows of vehicles worth more, collectively, than most people would earn across several lifetimes. He didn't gasp. He didn't smile the way she expected. He simply walked forward, slowly, and began to frown. Within minutes, Ethan had identified 3 separate problems that none of Victoria's expensive consultants had ever flagged, small details invisible to anyone without decades of hands-on restoration experience. A 1963 split-window Corvette had been stored under lighting that was slowly, imperceptibly damaging its original paint, the kind of harm that wouldn't show for years but would eventually prove irreversible. A rare pre-war Bugatti sat with its tires holding weight incorrectly, a mistake that would flatten the sidewalls over time and cost tens of thousands to correct later. He pointed out each issue calmly, without judgment, offering simple explanations of what needed to change and why, and Victoria found herself listening not as a woman being criticized, but as someone finally receiving honest information after years of hollow flattery. Her curators told her what she wanted to hear because their jobs depended on her satisfaction. Her board told her what protected their bonuses. Ethan told her the truth because it never occurred to him to do anything else. Standing in that vault, surrounded by machines worth a fortune, Victoria realized she had built an entire adult life around people who were careful never to disappoint her, and somehow that carefulness had left her feeling more alone than she'd ever admitted, even to herself. She asked him, almost testing him, whether he found the collection impressive at all, whether any part of it had genuinely moved him the way the Gullwing had. He considered the question seriously, walking the length of the vault once more before answering, and told her that impressive and loved were 2 very different things, that a room full of perfectly maintained machines could still feel strangely empty if nobody in that room actually understood what they were looking at. He said her father had clearly loved these cars once, that the acquisition records and the careful documentation proved as much, but that love left alone eventually calcifies into something closer to obligation, an inheritance nobody quite knows how to carry forward. Victoria said nothing for a long moment, staring at a car she had walked past 1,000 times without truly seeing it, and felt something uncomfortable settle in her chest, the sense that a stranger from rural Michigan had understood her family better in one afternoon than most people managed in years. They began talking more after that visit, not about business, not about cars specifically, but about the quieter things people rarely say out loud to strangers. Victoria told him. One evening over a dinner she hadn't planned to invite him to but somehow had. About growing up as the only child of a father who measured love in achievements, who praised report cards and business acumen but rarely simply asked how she was doing. She told him about the men who had drifted through her life over the years, most of them more interested in her name and her company than in anything genuinely hers, and how she had eventually stopped expecting anything different. Ethan, in turn, told her about his wife, a woman named Sarah, who had died of an illness that took her slowly enough to steal both their futures and quickly enough to leave him unprepared for the silence that followed. He told her about the years afterward, when work became the only language he still knew how to speak fluently, when the shop filled the hours that grief had hollowed out of his days. Neither of them cried while telling these stories. Neither of them needed to. They simply sat with the weight of what the other had shared. 2 people who had built entirely different lives around the same quiet ache of being profoundly alone, and something in that shared recognition settled between them like the first real warmth either of them had felt in years. The peace of those growing weeks didn't last, because peace rarely does when a company as large as Hayes Automotive sits exposed to the currents of the wider business world and one Monday morning Victoria walked into a board meeting to learn that a private equity fund had quietly acquired a significant stake in the company and was now pushing hard for a full buyout. The fund's representatives spoke in careful, clinical language about efficiency and shareholder value, but the substance of their proposal was simple and brutal. They wanted control of the company, and they wanted to liquidate anything they considered non-essential. To the balance sheet, starting with the classic car collection housed beneath the headquarters, Victoria argued fiercely in that boardroom, reminding everyone present that the collection wasn't simply decoration, that it represented her father's legacy and decades of careful acquisition, but the numbers on the projection screen didn't care about legacy. Several board members, worried about their own positions and payouts, began quietly aligning themselves with the fund's proposal. And Victoria left that meeting understanding, for the first time in her career, that she might actually lose the company her father had built from nothing. Worse still, the Mercedes, the very car that had brought Ethan into her life, sat on a preliminary list of assets earmarked for immediate sale should the buyout proceed. She called Ethan that night, her voice tighter than she wanted it to be, and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did. And when she finished, he asked a single question that hadn't occurred to anyone in that boardroom. Had the collection ever been independently reappraised in the last decade? Victoria admitted it hadn't, that the valuations on file were years old, calculated by insurance adjusters more concerned with liability than accuracy. And Ethan told her, calmly, that he suspected several of those valuations were badly, perhaps catastrophically, wrong. He asked for 2 weeks and full access to the vault. And against the advice of nearly everyone around her, Victoria gave him both. What followed were 14 days unlike anything the company's staff had witnessed before. As Ethan moved methodically through the collection with a magnifying loupe, a stack of reference manuals, and decades of hard-earned expertise that no consulting firm could replicate on short notice, he found chassis numbers that matched historically significant vehicles nobody had bothered to research properly. He uncovered a supposedly ordinary sedan that turned out to be one of only 4 surviving examples of its kind anywhere in the world. He documented everything meticulously, cross-referencing production records, matching factory stamps, building a case so thorough that even skeptical outside experts, once consulted, couldn't argue against his conclusions. When the final valuation report landed on the board's table 3 weeks later, the numbers had shifted so dramatically that the room fell into stunned silence. The collection wasn't worth the modest figure listed in outdated insurance paperwork. It was worth several times that amount, a figure so substantial that liquidating it wouldn't simply offset the buyout. It would fundamentally undermine the entire financial logic the private equity fund had built its offer around. Victoria stood before the board that day and presented the findings herself. Her voice steady, her confidence restored not by aggression, but by simple, undeniable fact. And one by one, the board members who had quietly sided with the fund began reconsidering their positions. The fund's representatives, faced with numbers they hadn't anticipated and a valuation too well documented to dispute, eventually withdrew their proposal, rather than risk a prolonged and expensive fight they were unlikely to win. Hayes Automotive remained independent. The collection remained intact, and Victoria walked out of that final meeting, feeling something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Genuinely, completely grateful to another human being for saving something that mattered to her. That evening, she drove to the shop in Michigan without calling ahead, walked through the open garage door, and simply hugged him, saying nothing at all, because for once words felt entirely unnecessary. Later, sitting on the tailgate of his old pickup truck under a sky full of stars that Chicago's light pollution never allowed her to see, she asked him quietly why he had been willing to spend 2 weeks of his own time, unpaid, buried in paperwork that had nothing to do with restoration work at all. He shrugged, the way he always did when a question touched on something he considered obvious, and told her that he'd watched people lose things that mattered to them before, watched Walter lose the very car sitting in his own garage because circumstances forced his hand, and he wasn't about to stand by and watch it happen again if there was anything at all he could do to prevent it. She reminded him that this wasn't quite the same situation, that a company wasn't a single beloved machine, and he simply looked at her and said that from where he was sitting, it looked exactly the same, because both were things built with somebody's whole heart, and both deserved better than being reduced to a number on a spreadsheet. Victoria laughed. A real laugh. The kind that surprised her by how easily it came, and admitted that she couldn't remember the last time anyone had spoken to her about her own company with that much plain, unguarded conviction. The board members who had once quietly sided against her sent careful, diplomatically worded emails in the following days, praising her leadership as though they hadn't nearly voted to dismantle it, and she found she no longer cared enough to feel bitter about any of it. Something about surviving that fight together, side by side rather than across a negotiating table, had settled a question in her mind that she hadn't even realized she'd been asking for weeks. The months that followed settled into something neither of them had experienced in years, a quiet, steady rhythm built around shared work rather than grand gestures. Victoria began spending her weekends in Michigan, trading boardrooms for the converted barn where Ethan worked, learning slowly how to hold a torque wrench correctly and how to listen for the subtle difference between an engine that was healthy and one that was merely pretending to be. They spent long hours restoring the Gullwing together, piece by piece, the two of them often falling into comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional clink of tools or the low hum of a radio playing old records neither of them bothered to change. Dinners became simple affairs eaten at a scarred wooden table in his kitchen. Nothing elaborate. Just food shared slowly between two people who no longer felt the need to perform for each other. On weekends, when the weather cooperated, they took test drives along winding back roads through the changing autumn countryside, the trees blazing orange and red against a sky that seemed determined to show off, and Victoria found herself laughing more in those drives than she had in years of curated dinners with people who wanted something from her. Ethan told her stories he'd never told anyone. Small memories of Walter, of Sarah, of a childhood spent tinkering with broken lawnmowers before he understood what any of it would eventually mean to him. Victoria told him things too, admitting fears she'd never voiced aloud, and somewhere in all those quiet exchanges, something had clearly, unmistakably changed between them. One evening in late October, with the Gullwing nearly finished and gleaming under the shop's overhead lights, Victoria found herself watching Ethan work with a focus that made her forget, briefly, everything waiting for her back in Chicago. She asked him, almost without meaning to, what he planned to do once the restoration was finished, where he thought he might go next, whether some other rare project might eventually pull him elsewhere the way this one had pulled him here. He set down the tool in his hand slowly, considered the question longer than she expected, and told her that it depended entirely on whether someone gave him a reason to stay in one place a little longer than usual. He didn't elaborate further, didn't turn the moment into anything more dramatic than it needed to be. But the way he looked at her when he said it left no real room for misunderstanding. Victoria felt something catch in her chest, a mixture of hope and fear, so unfamiliar that she almost didn't recognize either sensation. And for several long seconds neither of them said anything else at all. The shop was quiet, except for the low tick of a cooling engine somewhere nearby. Outside, the last light of an autumn evening was fading behind the barn's old wooden beams. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, silence between two people felt less like emptiness and more like the beginning of something neither was quite ready to name yet. Victoria drove back to Chicago that night later than she meant to, replaying the conversation over and over on the dark highway. And by the time she reached her apartment, she had already decided, somewhere in the quiet privacy of her own thoughts, exactly what she wanted her answer to be if he ever asked the question more plainly. She found herself, over the following weeks, rearranging her schedule with an ease that would have baffled her a year earlier, delegating meetings she once would have insisted on attending personally, simply so she could spend another weekend standing beside a workbench in Michigan instead of a conference table in Chicago. Her assistant noticed the change first, remarking once, carefully, that she seemed lighter lately. And Victoria had laughed and admitted that lighter was probably the correct word for it. Ethan noticed it too. In his own quiet way, in how she'd started leaving a spare pair of boots by his back door, in how she'd learned, without being taught twice, exactly how he liked his coffee in the mornings. Neither of them rushed the feeling. They simply let it grow the way Ethan let every good restoration grow, patiently, without forcing a single piece into place before it was ready, trusting that the right moment would eventually present itself on its own terms rather than anyone else's schedule. The finished Gullwing made its public debut at the largest classic car exhibition in the country, held that winter in a massive convention hall just outside Detroit, where collectors, journalists, and enthusiasts from across the nation gathered to see machines most of them had only ever read about. Ethan had worked on the final details for weeks leading up to the event, obsessing over stitching patterns and paint clarity with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything, while Victoria handled logistics behind the scenes, determined that Walter Grady's unfinished promise would finally be honored in front of the exact kind of audience who would understand its significance. When the car rolled onto the exhibition floor under carefully arranged lighting, its silver body gleaming, its iconic doors lifted upward in a pose that had made this model famous decades earlier, the room fell into the kind of hush reserved for something genuinely extraordinary. Judges moved around it slowly, running gloved hands along seams invisible to untrained eyes, murmuring quietly to one another as they documented details on their clipboards. Photographers circled it from every angle, and more than one veteran journalist who had covered these exhibitions for decades admitted afterward that they couldn't remember the last time a restoration had drawn quite this much quiet reverence from a crowd usually too busy, comparing notes to stand still. An elderly collector who had known Walter Grady personally decades earlier approached Ethan near the display, shook his hand for a long moment, and told him simply that Walter would have been proud, words that Ethan carried with him for the rest of the evening without saying much in response, beyond a quiet thank you. And when the results were finally announced that evening, the Gullwing took home the top honor of the entire exhibition, an award simply titled Best Restoration, presented before a crowd of hundreds who understood exactly how rare that recognition truly was. Victoria was asked to accept the award on the shop's behalf, given that the vehicle now technically belonged to her, and she walked up to that stage, prepared to say a few polite words about craftsmanship and history, the way convention usually demanded. Standing behind the podium, looking out at a sea of faces waiting for exactly the kind of speech they'd heard 100 times before, she found she couldn't bring herself to give it. Instead, she set the trophy down beside her and told them, plainly, that the award didn't really belong to a machine at all. She told them about a man who had learned everything he knew from a mentor who died believing he had failed to finish something important, and how that same man had spent years quietly carrying a promise nobody else even knew existed until the night he walked into an auction house wearing a jacket that made half the room laugh at him. She told them that some people knew how to repair engines, and some people knew how to repair the broken places inside another human being, and that the man standing near the edge of the stage, looking faintly embarrassed by the attention, happened to be remarkably skilled at both. The room erupted into applause loud enough to rattle the windows, but Victoria barely heard it because she was already walking toward Ethan, already reaching for his hand in front of hundreds of strangers who suddenly didn't matter at all. She told him, right there, without caring who was watching or what any headline the next morning might say, that she loved him, that she had loved him for longer than she'd been willing to admit even to herself, and that whatever fear had once kept her locked inside boardrooms and business strategies had quietly, completely dissolved somewhere along the winding back roads of rural Michigan. Ethan didn't hesitate. He reached into his jacket pocket, the same worn jacket he had worn to that first auction months earlier, and pulled out a small ring he had apparently been carrying for longer than she realized, waiting for a moment he hadn't been entirely sure would ever actually arrive. He told her simply that he had spent years believing love was something that happened once in a life and never returned after it was lost, and that she had proven him wrong in the quietest, most persistent way imaginable. He asked her to marry him right there on the exhibition floor, surrounded by gleaming machines and stunned onlookers, and Victoria said yes before he had even finished the question, laughing through tears she hadn't expected and didn't bother wiping away. A year later, The barn behind Ethan's farmhouse had been expanded into something neither of them could have fully pictured that first night in the auction hall. Now, housing not just his original restoration workshop, but a small academy dedicated to teaching young mechanics the increasingly rare art of preserving automotive history properly. Victoria had restructured a portion of Hayes Automotive's philanthropic budget to fund scholarships for students who couldn't otherwise afford the specialized training, and together, they ran the growing center with the same quiet partnership that had defined their relationship since the beginning. The Gullwing itself no longer traveled the exhibition circuit, having found a permanent, honored place in a glass display near the academy's entrance. A small plaque beside it, explaining, briefly, that it had once belonged to a man who never got to finish what he started, and to the two people who eventually finished it for him. Visitors sometimes asked about the story behind the plaque, and Ethan or Victoria would tell it simply, without embellishment, because the truth had never needed decoration to feel remarkable. What had begun as a single stubborn bid in a room full of strangers had become, slowly, and without either of them fully planning it, an entire shared life built on patience, honesty, and the particular kind of love that grows quietly between two people who finally stop pretending they don't need anyone at all. The car that once symbolized a promise between a dying man and his apprentice had become something larger still, a symbol of the moment two lonely lives had collided in an auction hall and, against every reasonable expectation, had found their way home in each other.